Okay, folks, here we are for the second part of our basic logic lesson. This half of the lesson is going to focus on the law of non-contradiction and self-defeating claims, or some otherwise are called self-refuting, self-defeating, self-referentially incoherent claims. All right. So last part of the lecture, we looked at some basic arguments, and we saw there that there are three basic ways that arguments can fail. They can have a factual error. So they have a premise or premises in there that is factually incorrect. So by factually incorrect, I don't simply mean just not true. I mean that it's not true or that it's false because of some kind of empirical evidence. Something that's disproven by science, right? So the example I gave in the last section was, if the moon is made of blue cheese, I can eat the moon. The moon is made of blue cheese, thus I can eat the moon. That's a valid argument. It has a valid form. It's a modus ponens. But the second premise, the moon is made of blue cheese, is disproven by science. It's got a factual error in there. There are also logical falsehoods or logical truths, right? And so that's where the idea of the law of non-contradiction comes in. And so we could have an argument with a factual error in it, and that would be a problem for that argument. It would mean that it can't prove the truth of its conclusion. The argument could contain a fallacy, either formal or informal. And then the third way is that it could have a violation of the law of non-contradiction in there. And so that's what this presentation is about. This is going to be a very handy tool for us, a logical tool for us to use as we start to look at various theories about skepticism, or like we'll do here, relativism, or the various theories of personal identity that we'll get into later in the course. All right, so first of all, there's this idea of truthiness, right? Some people show up to a philosophy class maybe thinking that philosophy is all subjective, or that all philosophical beliefs, none of them are universally true or objectively true. They're all just subjective. In other words, what they are really expressions more of the personality or the preferences of a speaker or an arguer, rather than anything that's really true. It's actual true, that is a person neutral or impartial or objective truth, right? So this is where this idea of truthiness comes in that you read about for this lecture from the Johnson article. So truthiness, as Colbert tells us, is just this idea that it's belief from the gut, right? Or unreflective, uncritical gut thinking is what he calls it, and what the author of the article talks about. So in other words, it's belief or the assertion of truth without regard to evidence, logic, facts, or intellectual examination, right? So some people, maybe they would think that maybe philosophy is all truthiness then, right? So that there's nothing, that when it comes to philosophical claims, it's all just a matter of what each individual happens to believe, and that no one's beliefs in this domain are really better or worse or more true or less probable than any others, right? Well, the law of non-contradiction is another tool that we have for sorting out what sorts of philosophical claims really are bogus and which ones are more plausible, at least logically speaking. So here I have a sign, right? Free contradictions, $1. So most of you probably recognize very quickly that there's a problem with what this sign is advertising. If something is free, then it doesn't cost $1, right? And if something costs $1, then it's also the case, or the idea that the statement "it costs $1" implies the truth of another statement pretty clearly, namely that it's the statement not free, right? So free contradictions can't cost $1. Notice we're figuring this out not on the basis of empirical information, just on the relationship of the ideas involved, the logical relationship of the ideas involved. Now, excuse me. Now, in this sign, the contradiction is implicit as opposed to explicit. Whenever in philosophy, whenever we are going to criticize a theory or a claim or a belief as being incoherent, logically incoherent or self-defeating, we have to show explicitly what the two statements are that make up the contradiction. You don't just get to say it's contradictory without any proof. You have to walk through the problem. You have to show that it's contradictory, and that almost always means making an implicit contradiction explicit. So implicit, implied, but not expressly stated. Explicit, expressly stated. So the law of non-contradiction has a long history. It's one of our basic laws of logic. And it's some of its earliest formulations come from Socrates in Plato's Republic, where he says the same thing clearly cannot act or be acted on upon in the same part or in relation to the same thing at the same time in contradictory ways, in contrary ways. Maybe not the best way of explaining what a contradiction is, because it just says contrary, and we're trying to figure out what exactly that means. Aristotle does flesh this out a little bit. He gives us our first system of formal logic. And he stated the law of non-contradiction a couple of different ways, but notice they're all driving at the same thing, that a proposition and its negation can't both be true at the same time in the same respect. So he says it's impossible that the same thing belong and not belong to the same thing at the same time in the same respect. No one can believe the same thing can at the same time be and not be. What he's really getting at there is that you can believe it, it's just that you can't rationally believe that both are true, right? So the most certain of all basic principles is that contradictory propositions are not true simultaneously. It is not possible to say truly that at the same time that the same thing is and is not a man, right? So the way I usually say it in more probably contemporary language is that a proposition and its negation or its opposite can't both be true at the same time and in the same respect. So just look at that first formulation of the law of non-contradiction there. It's impossible that the same thing belong and not belong to the same thing at the same time in the same respect. So it's not possible for Chris Blakely, me, right, to have both a full head of hair and to be bald at the same time and in the same respect. Now that's an empirical matter, right? You just got to observe Chris Blakely and figure out which one of those contradictions is true. But even if you don't know what Chris Blakely is referring to there, what physical being that Chris Blakely is, the name Chris Blakely is referring to there, you already know that it's the case that he can't be both bald and have a full head of hair at the same time in the same respect. So following up on that notion, or those formulations of the law of non-contradiction, is Aristotle's traditional square of opposition. And there are several different logical relationships on this table or on this graphic, but the one we're most concerned with are the opposites, the contradictory relationships. And so we have all S are P up here, right here, and then in order to disprove a universal claim, you don't have to show that that's never the case. You just have to show one instance in which it's not the case. So the contradiction of the universal affirmative statement, all S's are P's, is some S's are not P's. And again, some just means at least one. So again, an empirical example here, all roses are red. In order to prove that all roses are red is a false statement, I don't have to show that no roses are red. I just have to show that one thing that's a rose is not red, right? So if up here at the top, we have both of these statements are universal statements. One of these is universal affirmative. The other is universal negative, no S's are P's. And the contradiction of no S's are P's is some S's are, that no S is a P is that some S is a P, or some S's are P's, right? So we know that even if we don't know what S and P stand for, we know that universal negative and in particular affirmative can't both be true at the same time and in the same respect. If one of them is true, then we know the exact opposite is false and vice versa, right? So it's the basic idea of the law of non-contradiction. So a contradiction is the affirmation of a statement and its negation is true at the same time in the same respect. The law of non-contradiction says that that can't happen, that both of those things can't be true. And we got two different types of contradictions to worry about for our purposes. And I've already mentioned these terms, explicit contradictions and implicit contradictions. So most people don't run around affirming explicit contradictions or blatant, expressly stated contradictions. If they did, we'd probably wonder about, if they're okay or not. So most people don't walk around saying things like God exists and God does not exist, right? Contradictions are more likely to be implicit and buried beneath and implied by other things that we expressly believe. So attempting to discern and remove contradictions means thinking about all those logical relationships, all the relationships between all the different beliefs that I have, and then figuring out if any of them are in tension, and if they really are contradictions, which one might be true. So an explicit contradiction is the assertion of a proposition and its exact denial at the same time in the same respect. An implicit contradiction, like in our sign, free contradictions $1, is asserting a claim such that the addition of another claim logically entailed or implied by the original claim produces an explicit contradiction. So go back to our sign here, free contradictions $1. There's two different ways we could do this. We could say that free implies that it does not cost $1, and then we'd have an explicit contradiction between does not cost $1 and costs $1. Or if we take it costs $1 and say that that implies it is not free, we'd have an explicit contradiction between free and not free. So two different ways of making that explicit there, right? The implicit contradiction there, explicit, depending on which way you go. Showing that a philosophical theory or an argument is contradictory is almost always going to require you to walk through the steps of showing how, assuming for the sake of argument, the claims in that argument or that theory, how they imply the truth of a contradiction. And since we know that contradictions can't be true, we know that one of those claims, or maybe both of them, have to be false. Okay, wouldn't be both. One of them would be false. All right. So that's the idea of a self-defeating or self-contradictory claim, theory, or statement. It's any claim or theory that ultimately prove themselves to be false because their truth would require the truth of a contradiction, but since we know contradictions can't be true, we know that it's got to be false, right? So they're said self-contradictory or self-referentially incoherent or self-refuting ideas. Those are all different phrases that mean the same basic thing, a violation of the law of non-contradiction. So how do we go about identifying a self-defeating claim? Well, we got a couple of basic steps here. First, we suppose for the sake of argument, and what I mean by for the sake of argument, we're just entertaining the idea that it's true, right? So we ask ourselves, suppose that X or P is true, what else has to be true? What does it imply is also true? What's logically entailed by it? So first, we just assume for the sake of argument that, or conditionally, hypothetically, for the sake of argument, that the claim in question is true. And then we consider the logical implications, either those that are presupposed or those that are implied by the original claim, right? And then and here I'm using X instead of P to stand in for a claim or a proposition. So if claim X is true, what does it imply about the truth of that claim itself, right? So some statements make claims about all statements, including itself. There's a self-referential or self-referential part of the idea of a self-defeating or self-refuting claim or theory. And then if the implication of assuming the truth of that claim is that X has to be false, then it's self-defeating or self-contradictory, right? So if assuming, and it might involve several steps to show that, though there might be several links in that chain. So if we assume that a proposition is true, and then that assumption implies the truth of either implicitly or explicitly the exact opposite of that, the opposite of that original claim, we've got a self-defeating or self-refuting theory or claim or argument. So consider the following. Here's our first example, and this is just using the idea of individual relativism that is discussed in the Johnson article. So individual relativism is just the view that there are no universal truths and that all so-called truth claims or truth assertions are relative to or dependent upon the individual. So everything then is to be true for me, but not necessarily true for you. It's that way of talking. So here I've labeled it claim one. So claim one is there are no universal truths. So the content of that proposition explicitly denies that there are any truths that are universal. It doesn't deny that there are particular truths. It's saying that all truths are particular truths as opposed to universal. So one explicitly claims that something is true about all truth claims or all assertions, right? Namely, that the truth of all those assertions or propositions or beliefs is relative to or dependent upon the individual, or maybe an individual culture if it's cultural relativism. So note that claim 1 is itself a declarative statement. It declares something is true. That's what I mean by a truth claim. I don't mean that it's actually true. I mean that it makes an assertion that it's true. So the proposition asserts that something is the case, namely that itself is true, right? Why else would you be asserting this, right? The affirmation of the statement makes an assertion itself. So if one is true, then that means that the truth of one is also relative to the individual. The problem is that it says that's the case for any truth. You probably noticed the problem there, right? That it's a self-defeating or self-referentially incoherent claim. It doesn't say that there are some universal truths. It says there are no universal truths, right? But that claim itself is a truth assertion. So assuming for the sake of argument that it's true, let's say that that's true, and then it's a universal claim, right? So there's becomes the problem. So if we assume this for the sake of argument that there are no universal truths is a true statement itself, it implies, right, the truth of another statement, namely that there are some universal truths, and which is the exact opposite of our original claim. They both can't be true at the same time in the same respect. The one that generates the contradiction is assuming the truth of there are no universal truths, is assuming the truth of that statement. So that's the one that's false. It generates the contradiction, so we know that that statement has to ultimately be false. Right, so pause and kind of walk through that again, maybe read through the section of the textbook again there. That's the example right at, not the textbook, the Johnson article, that's the example that he gives in that main section on individual relativism. Here's another argument. Since we're talking about Rick and Morty, Rick is a scientist. It's not hard to imagine Rick maybe offering this kind of argument, since Rick seems to hold the view that the only things that are true are scientific truths, as opposed to philosophical truths, non-empirical truths. In other words, the only things that can be proven empirically are the only things that can be objectively true, impartially or person-neutral truths. So in Rick and Morty, in the universes, in the multiverse of Rick and Morty, it's true that that reality is comprised of a multiverse, no matter how you feel about it, right? Which is a person-dependent thing, how you feel about it, right? So in other words, it describes reality. It's that idea of the correspondence truth, the correspondence theory of truth that's also discussed in the reading assignment. So here's how this argument goes, and notice that this is a complex argument made up of made up of a combination of two basic argument forms that we've already learned. So here's the argument. If a belief is objectively true, then it can be proved by science, empirical verification, scientific proof, right? Observation of the world outside my own head. So again, if something's if the statement there is a purple trash can in the room is true, then that statement has to correspond to some state of affairs. You have to trust me on this. There's no purple trash can in this room or in Rick's garage here. Right? There is, however, some time travel stuff up on the shelf over there. Right? So first premise in the argument, if a belief is objectively true, then it can be proved by science. In other words, it admits to empirical verification, right? Philosophical beliefs, this is the second premise, are not proved by science. And we know this because of our working definition of philosophy is that philosophical beliefs are non-empirical. They are not the sorts of things that can be proven by science or observation of the world. Thus, philosophical beliefs are not objectively true. That's a modus tollens argument, right? And then stacking onto that argument is another argument form, disjunctive syllogism. So we use the conclusion of the first stage of the argument. Now that becomes a new premise in the second stage. Thus, philosophical beliefs are not objectively true. Well, line 4, premise 4, either a belief is merely subjective, in other words, it's person specific, it's true only for them, right? Or because of them, because they believe it, right? It's the idea of a subjective truth is that it's true because I believe it's true, right? Or it's objectively true. It's person neutral. So I use merely there because things that are merely subjective are representative of just the speaker or the person. They are not objectively true. Now, maybe people hold a belief that is subjectively, they hold a belief for subjective explanations or reasons, but like, suppose I just happen to randomly think that the earth is a sphere or spherical, but that belief is not merely subjective because it can be proved by science. You just have to go far enough out in the universe in space to look back and see that it's spherical, right? Apologies to flat earthers here. Right, so either a belief is merely subjective or person specific or objectively true, meaning person neutral, impartially true. True regardless of whether anybody believes it or not, right? And then the final conclusion following from 3 and 4 is thus philosophical beliefs are merely subjective, right? So it's not hard to imagine Rick given that kind of argument. Sometimes students show up to a philosophy class believing this very sort of thing, or sometimes dismissive of philosophy because, well, it's not scientific, so it can't really show us anything that's objectively that's objectively true for everybody, right? Regardless of what we happen to believe, but that is true, right? In that capital T sense of the term. Well, let's think about this argument for a second. That first premise, a belief is objectively true, then it can be proved by science or empirical verification, however you want to say that, is like saying the following. So in other words, we're saying that premise 1 it entails this claim that I'm labeling in here, right? No philosophical statement is objectively true. Well, what kind of statement is claim in? Is it the kind of statement that is an empirical statement? Can it be proved by science, or is it a philosophical statement? Well, if you think about it, that statement is not empirically verifiable. It's not the sort of claim that can be proven by science. It's in fact a non-empirical, which is to say a philosophical claim, right? Now, suppose for the sake of argument that claim in is true. Well, if claim in is true, then there has to be at least one philosophical truth, namely that statement itself, right? So again, to walk back through this one more time, what kind of statement is statement in? In is no philosophical statements are objectively true. Well, it's a non-empirical truth. It can't be proved by science. So suppose in is true. Remember, we're entertaining the idea of that this argument is sound, and then thinking about whether it's logically coherent, right? So suppose in is true. Again, that's the underlying assumption of premise 1 in our argument. What does it imply about the truth of itself? Again, there's a self-referential part there. So self-defeating, self-refuting, right? Well, if claim in is true, it can't be true because it's non-empirical, and the statement explicitly denies that any philosophical claims, any non-empirical claims, can be objectively true. So that looks like premise 1 then is false. It violates the law of non-contradiction. So go back to that argument there. Valid argument form, but premise 1 violates the law of non-contradiction, since assuming the truth of that claim generated the contradiction, we know that that claim is ultimately false. We got a valid argument, but one that's unsound because it violates the law of non-contradiction. Let's take a look at one more example. This time, let's look at an argument about morality. Moral relativism is the view that morality is relative to or dependent upon particular times and places or cultures. Sometimes people give what's called the tolerance argument for moral relativism. So it's an argument that has that runs the following. Again, it's a two-stage argument. You'll notice that they're both valid forms. So we don't have to worry about validity here. We're just worried about whether or not it commits any informal fallacies, has any errors of fact, or has any contradictions in it. So if there are universal moral truths, and by moral truth here, I mean a prescriptive truth that tells us how we ought to behave, right? Then we ought practice intolerance towards cultures with differing moralities, or towards cultures with different moral values from our own. So the idea here is that, well, obviously ours are right. It's another underlying assumption of the argument here. premise 2. But what we ought to do, we all know this, of course, that we ought to practice tolerance towards cultures with differing moral values. Thus, there are no universal moral truths. So that's a modus tollens stage 1 of the argument there. It gets us to line 3. That's the conclusion of the first stage, but it's just, since we got a multiple stage argument here, it's just going to become a new premise in the second stage of the argument. So they're linked together. So we've got line 3 then, thus there are no universal moral truths. If there are no universal moral truths, the morality is relative to cultural consensus. Thus, from lines 3 and 4, we get to the final conclusion, thus morality is relative to cultural consensus. There's the moral relativism conclusion, right? And then this is what we always ask about arguments in philosophy. Does it contain any major errors of fact, fallacy, or self-contradiction? Remember, those are the 3 basic ways that an argument can fail. And of course, we need to explain why that's the case. You can't just assert that you think that's the case. You got to show it, right? You got to prove it. So take a look at this here. So we've got the first line says, if there are no universal moral truths, then we ought to practice tolerance towards cultures with different moral values. The second line asserts a universal prescriptive truth. I'm taking here to mean a universal that everyone ought to do this. So it says, we or everyone ought to practice tolerance towards cultures with differing moral values. Well, that's the assertion. Again, we're entertaining the idea that, for the sake of argument, that the claims here are true. So it's the assertion of a universal prescriptive claim, a moral truth. The third line, however, explicitly denies that there are any universal moral truths, right? So premise 2 asserts a prescriptive truth, if premise 2 is true, then it logically entails that there is at least one or some moral truths, namely the truth of that statement itself. Again, there's the self-referential part. And then 3, the subconclusion the new premise for the second stage of the argument explicitly denies that there are any universal prescriptive truths. So lines 2 and 3 contradict each other in this argument. Flawed argument, then the argument fails to support the truth of the conclusion. Maybe another argument might support the truth of moral relativism, but the tolerance argument, once you think about it and think about the logic of the ideas that are involved, looks plainly self-defeating or contradictory. All right, so there's a little bit about about the law of non-contradiction and self-defeating claims and theories and how to identify them. It might take you a couple of passes through that reading or through this lecture to start to get a handle on that. The thing that people have the most trouble with there seems to be the self-referential part about it. So you want to start thinking about, okay, I've made this claim, but what does that claim imply back about that original claim? There's the self-reflective part of it. All right, so be sure and read through that very carefully. If you have any questions about anything in this lecture, be sure and either post them in the discussion forum or raise them during the live Q&A session. All right, so that'll do it for our logic lesson. A lot packed into these 2 lectures for today, but we'll get more and more used to using this language and more used to thinking in this way. Because the rest of the readings do this kind of thing. They kind of lay out positions, then start thinking about whether they're contradictory or not, or lay out to a criticism and try to identify a flaw in an argument that's being leveled by that criticism. So if you don't get it immediately, don't freak out, but you do need to start making sure you have those ideas down, right? Okay, I'll see y'all next time around.